Okay, we're going to reconvene with Lake Whatcom Reservoir Natural Resources, and Councilmember Dan Hamill is the chair.
Thank you, Picky. Joining me today on the committee are Council Members Knudsen and Borneman. We have one item before us. This is a proposed wetland and habitat mitigation program update. I'm just going to read the summary statement so we're on the same page here. City of Bellingham is developing a wetland and habitat mitigation program to benefit our community. The goals of the program are to improve the success rate of mitigation projects, reduce costs associated with mitigation, coordinate mitigation efforts, and streamline the mitigation process. Public Works staff has been working with consultants and outside experts to determine future mitigation demand. Based on this research, staff will provide a recommended mitigation program type and scope. And here today with us is Ted Carlson and Annalise.
Great, thank you. Ted Carlson, Public Works Department, along with Renee LaCroix and Annalise Burns. As Council is aware, we've been talking for several years now about a wetland mitigation program. Have been making some strides on that, engaged some consulting help, as Dan mentioned in the summary statement, and we're here to kind of check in, bring you up to speed on where we're at, and we will be asking for some direction today, not formal action, but want to confirm that we're on the right track and that Council doesn't have any concerns with the direction that the steering committee is recommending. So with that, I'll turn it over to Annalise. She has a quick presentation, and then we'll be happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm Annalise Burns with Public Works Natural Resources. So I came to you last in September, and we had an update on where the mitigation program was at that point. And as was just mentioned, we're now here for some guidance that we're on the right track. So to bring us back to where we were when I came in September, we did not know, well, actually, before I start this, to make sure we're all on the same page for mitigation program, you've heard it before, but just as a reminder, mitigation, we're talking about wetlands and streams. Those are the main critical areas types we're talking about, and when there's an unavoidable impact to those critical areas, then someone is required to do mitigation. And so it's trying to figure out how can we do mitigation in a better way. So the way that we do mitigation now, or the way that's most common, is for an individual developer, be that a school district or a single-family residential builder or the City Parks Department, that project is responsible for doing mitigation for their own project. And so mitigation is kind of done little piece by little piece, and it's been shown throughout the country and throughout this region that a better, more effective way to increase or at least maintain critical areas functions, as well as a more cost-effective way to do it, is to pool those resources, strategically combine the funds, and then strategically plan for how to do mitigation on a broader range more proactively. And that's what a mitigation program would do. And so in order to get a handle on whether that would work for Bellingham, we needed to know what the demand is for mitigation. And so when I came in September, that was an unknown demand. And we were looking at about a 10 to 20-year time horizon. We also didn't know, we needed to figure out the appropriate mitigation program. There are different kinds. One is an in lieu fee program, or ILF program. Another one is a mitigation bank, and another one is advanced compensatory mitigation. So those were the two main questions before us that we hadn't answered when I came in September. And since that time, we've done a tremendous amount of work with our consultants and staff. We also formed a steering committee. So we had a steering committee composed of relevant staff from various city agencies or departments, as well as Whatcom County and WSDOT, major mitigation users. We had that steering committee and then our consulting team. And in the process of about 3 months, we asked different potential mitigation users what they thought the demand would be in the next 10 years. So we talked to private developers, we talked to utilities, including like Williams Pipeline, we talked to school districts, we talked to the Port of Bellingham, we talked to Whatcom County, WSDOT, got a pretty broad range of trying to understand what mitigation needs were, including our own city departments. So we then, well, We then came up with a calculation of what that demand might be, and it came out to be about 30 acres of impact over about 10 years, which sounds like a small number, but if you think about it, it's 30 acres of actual wetland and stream impact, which is quite large, actually. And we vetted those numbers through our steering committee to make sure that those numbers seemed right. We had a kind of a gut check with everyone. Then we looked at that demand and said, okay, what does that mean for what kind of program that might be best for the city? That level of demand supports either an in-lieu fee program or a bank. But when you get to 30 acres of impact over 10 years, it does not seem reasonable then to pursue an advanced compensatory mitigation. And that's partly because of our understanding of what the city wants to do with this program. So our understanding is the city would like to be more effective, both ecologically and monetarily with their mitigation. But ideally, we would want that option of a bank or an in-lieu fee program to be available to not only our city departments, but also to the private sector. And an advanced compensatory mitigation is a single user. It would be just the city that could use it, and there would be no private use. So at that point, our steering committee said, okay, that's not, the advanced compensatory mitigation doesn't fulfill everything the city wants the program to do, and we have enough demand, it seems, that we could look at an in-lieu fee and a bank. So let's look at which, between in-lieu fee and bank, which makes the most sense for the city. So in order to bring your thought process through so you can understand what we ended up with, I wanted to go through the main differences between bank and in-lieu fee programs. So first, a bank requires upfront investment. So you build it before you sell the credits. So it takes the money to build that on-the-ground restoration or on-the-ground improvement to a wetland and stream, as well as getting through the permitting process. An in-lieu fee program, in contrast, you do go through the permitting process, but the rest of it, the on-the-ground work that you do, you pay as you go. So you take in your impact fees, collect it over time, and then build your on-the-ground restoration or mitigation in this case. Banks address temporal loss. In-lieu fee do not address temporal loss. And what that means is part of the reason why we're even looking at a program is because one of the downfalls of the way that we're doing mitigation now is that when a developer impacts a wetland or stream, we allow that to happen. So we allow the degradation of water quality impacts and flood control and habitat, and then they build mitigation. And so in the future, you're going to offset that loss, but there's a temporary period of time where you're recognizing that you're having a lower quality of your habitats. And banks, because you build it up front, you build it first, and then you sell credits, you don't have that temporal or that temporary loss in function. In lieu fee, because you pay as you go, you collect your fees and then you build it, it's the same temporal loss as we have now. Banks usually have larger sites. So if you're going to identify a mitigation site for improving, they're generally on the order of 30 to 50 acres. And in lieu fee tends to be lots of smaller sites, so 10 to 20 acres. Banks, you have one large service area. So you usually have a larger mitigation site. You sort of put your eggs all in one basket, and you have a large area, geographic area that you can collect fees from. So a developer could be doing a project in a large region and pay into that one large project is the typical way that banks operate. In lieu fees instead have these smaller sites scattered throughout the landscape, and then each site kind of has a small geographic area that a project could pool into. So a developer can only be in a small region that would be associated with that small mitigation site. It's just a different way of dividing up the world. The next line is that banks focus on wetland and stream restoration, which is a type of mitigation that has the highest form of credit generation, meaning for every square foot of ground that you're going to improve, you're going to get more credits out of that square foot of ground. So you're going to have more to sell for every square foot. In contrast, in lieu fees tend to focus on small sites. They tend to be more urban. And so you really are only left with preservation and enhancement, which is a kind of mitigation that's great, but it isn't process changing kind of mitigation. And so it tends to generate less credits. So for the same square foot of area, you're going to have less credits. You're going to have less to sell. Banks, administrative burden is lower, and in lieu fee, the administrative burden then, of course, is higher. And the reason, partly the reason, is because banks, the build it before you sell it model gives agencies assurance that what you're doing is on the right track, it's going to be successful. You've already proven success before you sell the product. And so they have less oversight over what you're doing. They're more confident in what you're doing. So you have less administrative burden, which means less time going through a permit process, as well as the administration of the program itself. So that administrative burden is not done when you open the doors for credit sales. It happens for the whole life of the program, including the operation. And in lieu fee, there's much more oversight by the agencies all the way through operation of the program, including your credit price and who you're selling to and how. And the PowerPoint says it's a more complex, tailored process because of those smaller sites. Also, it's just more paperwork, and it's usually a higher cost and less flexibility. And banks, because of all the things that we just talked about, credit cost is lower. You have a larger site, you have a larger service area, you have less administrative burden, both in permitting as well as operation of the bank. And so your credit price is lower compared to in lieu fee. I had mentioned here that credit cost might be somewhere in the average range of $300,000 a credit per credit acre. Credit per acre, and in lieu fee would be about 800. Don't get too stuck on the 300 and 800 exact numbers. It's more relative to each other, so you can see the in lieu fee is more than twice the cost for the developer as the bank. So either program will pencil. We are required as a public agency to make sure that the fees we collect cover the cost of the program. But for the developer paying in, when they want to say, well, how much is your credit? How am I going to buy this product that you're offering? Are they paying $300,000 or are they paying $800,000 per credit? So the recommended solution that both our consulting team as well as the steering committee has come forward with is taking mostly the great parts about the bank option and a little bit of the things we can pull from in lieu fee that we liked. And this is called an umbrella mitigation bank. And what we're proposing is a regional bank, meaning it would extend outside the city limits, outside of the UGA, and it would include multiple bank sites. So remember when I said we were putting all our eggs in one basket with a bank? We have one big site with one big service area. We don't think that that probably serves the best needs of the community. We feel like there's probably, we should have maybe 3 or 4 different sites in the region and do a little bit of matching where the impacts happen with where the mitigation is happening. So the benefits of this is that you can lead with 1 or more city sites. So that's what we would propose. The first site would be a site that is within a city watershed. But then, once that's up and running and we've got credits that we're selling and we're showing financial success, we can add additional sites as we see fit. And we can do that according to what the market can bear. And we don't have to do all of the on-the-ground work ahead of the market catching up to us. So those sites could be in the county or they could be in the city, depending on where the market demand is. So that helps us by having more than one site and extending outside of the city limits. It does help meet regional restoration goals. There's a lot of things that need to be done to improve various things in the region, including water quality that ends up in our Bellingham Bay, and salmon recovery goals that also affect the economy that City of Bellingham depends on. It also, because we would extend outside the city limits, it would mean that we could pick sites that are not only urban, they could be rural, they have ability to average costs. So we could pick some sites that are less expensive. The most expensive mitigation sites will be within the city. If we also do mitigation sites out in the county, those will be less expensive sites. It would mean we can kind of average the costs for the administration of this program as well as the credit price, and that's how we get our credit price down to something that's reasonable. It can be implemented over time as funds are available. So there is that upfront cost of getting it up and running and securing the land, but then the on-the-ground work can be done as funds are available and as credit demand dictates. It provides mitigation for both public and private sector. It is the more flexible and less expensive option. It addresses that temporal loss that I mentioned. And the permit process, I didn't mention this yet, but the permit process is faster than an in-lieu fee. So for a bank, it typically takes about 3 years from the time that we submit the prospectus, which is the application. So by the time we submit the application, it's about 3 years to get it up and running. For an in-lieu fee program, it's more than that. It's 5 to 6 years. And again, don't quote me exactly on the amount of time. This really depends on how much staff time the federal and state agencies can dedicate, so it depends on their funding. And the cost of the mitigation credit, the cost of the mitigation credit covers the cost of the program, like I mentioned before. But what everyone needs to know going in is the bank is the one that requires a little bit more upfront cost to get it up and running. So that's bringing you through our thought process of why we're recommending the Umbrella Mitigation Bank as a regional program. And we really want to hear from you to make sure that that is in keeping with your vision of the program and that you'd like us to continue on this path. Thank you.
Thank you. Committee members. Terry.
Yeah, a couple of questions on the differences between using a larger area and using the small areas in terms of the actual environmental function that's performed. It's always been my understanding when you use a larger area, you're retaining much more of that environmental function that you're designing it for, greater chances of success and things. At least that's been my understanding. With going with a group of smaller ones, will we lose those advantages? Because, we're trying to retain those kinds of, what wetlands are meant for and used for in the natural environment.
Yeah, I can clarify a couple of things, and then Renee, do you want to take it from there? Yeah. So what we're proposing is actually pretty large sites. So our recommendation is an in-lieu fee program, which is the other alternative, is those really smaller sites, and we agree that smaller sites sometimes are harder to be successful. But we also want to make sure we're not putting all our eggs in one basket and only improving one watershed. And so we are proposing the larger sites, but a couple of them so that we can have a couple different watersheds benefit. Is that?
In either one of those, hi, Renee LaCroix, Public Works, either one of those, the in-lieu fee or the bank is a major improvement from the way we're currently doing things. And you're correct in that these small isolated sites, the way that we're currently doing things, have a low ecological function compared to what we're proposing.
Yeah, almost anything would be an improvement over what we have, because we end up losing because most of them don't work and no one's held accountable for them after they die off, and we lose the function of it. But when you're saying you're throwing numbers of size, what are we talking about? Because I still don't know. Because before you were talking, in size as 20, 30 acres as opposed to what are we talking about with this?
Yeah, and I think part of that is because we haven't identified the sites yet. We have some ideas of some really good sites, but we wanted to check in with you and make sure we're on the right path. But what we would be doing next is to say, okay, with this council direction, we're on the right track. Let's look at which sites make sense, and we would be looking ecologically what makes sense as well as financially. We do need this program to pencil. And so the sites that we've been looking at have been all over 40 acres. So we're talking in the range of 60 to 200 acres sites.
Okay. Michael.
Well, so sort of pursuing that a bit, I had a different question until you said that. If the total demand is 30 acres, and if we are working on a 40 or 50 acre site, does that mean that the credit applies to all 40 or 50 acres, or just 4 or 5 acres in the middle? And also, my understanding is that on the demand number, that it isn't usually for some mitigation, it's not 1 for 1. If you impact 1 acre, you don't mitigate 1 acre. If you impact 1, you might mitigate 3 acres. So does that 30 represent the multiplier taken into account?
Yeah, and I didn't get into the numbers because it gets a little complicated, but because you're pretty savvy, I think we can go there. So the typical way that we do mitigation now means that someone does an impact, and they have to figure out how much mitigation. That impact, the amount of mitigation they do has to depend on how high a quality that site was. So let's say we were medium quality wetland. Okay, so we know that you're going to want to replace it with a medium quality wetland, but we don't know if you're going to be very successful in your mitigation. So we're going to make you do more mitigation because it's an insurance policy. And so typically you're in the range of about 6 to 1. So for every acre that you impact, you're doing 6 acres of mitigation. Around that. It varies from like 2 to 1 to 20 to 1. So, but right around 6 is where people end up being. Because you'd have a mitigation bank, or this would be true for an in-lieu fee program too, the agencies are assured that you're actually doing it in a way that is probably going to be more successful. So you have less need for that insurance policy. So the amount of mitigation that someone needs when they buy a credit out of a bank is less than they would need if they did their own mitigation. But it is not a 1 for 1. So when we said 30 acres of impact, you're going to need a lot more than 30 acres of mitigation to be able to cover those needs of those users.
Roxanne.
Well, just with my background in economic development, I've been crossing my fingers and rooting for a customized bank option. So I'm just going to keep cheering for that. So thank you for your work in the development of this.
Gene?
So it being the holiday season, when you get it all wrapped up, tied up in a bow, you'll bring it back and we'll bless it. Is that what the plan is? Okay, thank you. Looks good. You're on the right track.
Terry, then Michael.
Yeah, I'm more than willing to support the umbrella mitigation bank as long as we've got assurances that we are going to go with some sizes that will really make sense and make some differences. Because I know that the current policy is not working, and we end up losing, we say we're going to allow someone to mitigate, but we end up losing that environmental function. It just, it hasn't been working. And if you going with larger areas, and we can keep the cost down with it by doing that, yeah, that's the direction I can support.
Michael.
Yeah, I'm with Terry 100%. I like the recommendation. I believe this is the approach we should take. But I do still have a couple questions. One of the advantages of the current, location by location approach is that the restoration or the enhancement or the preservation is near where the impacts are. It's nice that they're relatively close to each other. There's a lot of other disadvantages, though. You referred to several times in memos to the idea of service areas, and I know with the in-lieu fee program, the in-lieu fee mitigation needs to be in the same service area as the original impact. How big are the service areas? Do we define them citywide, Whatcom County-wide, or are they defined by sub-basin or watershed basin? So I'm trying to get an idea, because what I wouldn't like to see is we do mitigation out in Kemble for impacts here on the bay, and those are wildly different, marine environments, way uplands in the hills. I don't want to get them too wildly different. So how big are our service areas, and how closely or similarly related will be the location of the impacts and then the location of the mitigations?
So the service area is negotiable. So when we bring in a prospectus or a proposal to the agencies, we have to show how our service area is ecologically valid. So they don't care about your money. And so they want to say, is it makes sense that you're going to take impacts from this regional area and put the mitigation here ecologically. And, but typically for banks in the region, meaning anywhere in Washington state, those banks tend to have one site and a pretty large mitigation area because it's recognized you can have benefits at one location that ends up benefiting a wide part of the watershed or multiple watersheds. We, in our discussions with staff and management and our steering committee, didn't feel comfortable doing it quite that extreme, how most banks do it. We want to make sure that that impact is a little bit closer to the mitigation than maybe the agencies would even allow. And so our idea is, and this is kind of what our problem solving has to be on this next step, is we are probably going to have to figure out a system of where if someone's coming in with an impact, how are we going to say which mitigation site is more, which is better ecologically for them to pay into, and how do we phase that so that we don't have to build all of our mitigation sites at once. And so it'll be looking at market demand. Where do we expect the impacts to happen first? Let's build those sites first. And if we start to realize that there's market developing in a different region, let's start implementing that mitigation site that's closer to that area. But that is one of the trade-offs that a bank versus an in lieu fee. If we're going to have a lower credit cost and we're going to have those other advantages of a bank, all of our mitigation will be a little bit further away from the impact than maybe an in lieu fee program would have, which is a much more tailored approach, a much smaller geographic.
Okay, well, you're looking
coupling.
for feedback, and I guess my feedback would be I appreciate and agree with your approach. I don't want the mitigation bank to be so large that there's not any relationship. And if we're looking at several mitigation properties, it would be nice, as you say, to kind of have like for like, but let's not be too rigid about it. But yeah, if we're doing, restoration way up in the foothills and it's shoreline impacts, that doesn't make any sense either.
Okay, yeah.
Terry, then April.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, do we need a motion from the commission, from our committee to provide direction, or just our verbal direction from the?
I think just verbal direction that we're on the right track is adequate for us, yes.
Okay. April.
So thank you for the written summary and then this, bringing it in two different ways. It was easy for me. I'm not as educated on these things, so I felt like I got a pretty good education on it. Okay. I really appreciate your presentation style, and I know that we lost Renee in that position, and now you've come in and really filled the shoes well, and I really appreciate that, continuing this process. So I do have a question in regards to, the words, I got a little bit caught up on the preservation and enhancement of one program versus the wetland stream restoration. I imagine there's some gray areas there, and it just rung a bell that I felt like we had preservation and enhancement monies in the new parks levy. So I thought even if we don't go with the in lieu fee, there might still be an opportunity for funds, because that's still really important too.
So, I think this is worth clarifying that in lieu fee tends to be smaller sites. They tend to be in urban areas. And if you think about our city, we've got some great habitat corridors, some wetlands and streams, but you're probably going to be enhancing something that's already there or preserving something that's already there. We're not going to go create 50 acres of new wetland in downtown Bellingham. So that preservation and enhancement that's usually within lieu fee is because they're usually urban sites. What we're proposing for the umbrella mitigation bank is saying, okay, we're going to do some things that are more typical of a bank, which means we're going to go out into the landscape beyond the city of Bellingham where we can really we can create a large acreage of wetland, and we can really restore those processes that we just can't do in an urban setting. But knowing that we really want to have our city watersheds restored also,
we're going to couple that with some more expensive preservation and enhancement sites within the city that we don't want to lose track of. So we will be having preservation and enhancement within the city, and then also some restoration out in the rural landscape.
Yeah,
So,
I appreciated that, and I also appreciated that in your presentation you mentioned that in the first project you would try to do, I think what Michael is saying is that finding parts that will impact, that will have the benefits that will at least where the impacts were as well, or somewhere in that line. So thank you for pointing that out in your presentation. That was one of my concerns with this, but I think you've all done a lot of work, and I'm excited as well to see where this goes.
thank you.
Michael.
Thanks. Is one more question? And several times the memo refers to a broader programmatic approach that allows us to take into account regional restoration priorities. What are those regional restoration priorities? Have we written them down already? Are we going to decide what they are? With whom do we decide those regional priorities?
We have a WIRA 1 regional salmonid recovery plan.
Okay.
And so this is an opportunity to have the city participate more strategically than we currently already do in some of those priorities.
Okay. I do like the idea of taking a regional, broader approach. But sort of like the other thing, we can go too far. We can take care of all the problems in the Nooksack Basin, and yet we've got our own, nearshore habitats to worry about. We've got our own Lake Whatcom watershed and our own rivers to worry about.
Yeah,
so those regional priorities, we can't give up entirely our Bellingham focus.
No, we would use that document to inform what we already are trying to achieve with this program. So we'd be looking at within the geographic area, within the basin, what are the opportunities that meet our needs? And if we could address regional needs in the process, great. If can't, then we stick with what our primary goals of the program are.
Great.
And I think it's just worth noting that, if we only focused on the city, what would happen is that our credit price would be very high. And so by looking a little bit more broad, what we're using that as is a way to sort of average those costs and get some of the work done that we want within the city for a more reasonable cost, and also help with that administrative burden that we would have if we only looked within the city. And if we only looked within the city, it starts to tip us toward, it might not pencil very well, and it might tip us toward the advanced compensatory mitigation model, which would be city-only use, not for private development. There's at some point, the cost just does not work in the marketplace.
Thanks. So it sounds like you're doing a balancing act. I appreciate that. And then one of the other questions had to do with one of the advantages of this kind of bank program is the city has its own significant mitigations that we'll need to do. We'll be one of the main users, but we want to make it available to can increase the scale of the program. Let's invite some other people to participate. What proportion of the demand is us, the city, and what proportion is thought to be outside users? Is it 50-50, 90-10?
We haven't overturned every rock and found every mitigation need in the next 10 years. But based on that very kind of cursory look, it looks like we're about a third.
Mayor Kelly?
Well, I'm going to join in with April and Roxanne and everybody else who's excited about this. When I used to work at the state level on water issues, you weren't allowed to do the big mitigation banks. I mean, you couldn't, because everyone believed that you had to do them on site. And I think that what the presentation shows today is those aren't successful. They don't benefit the environment as much as being able to find a place that you can get quality restoration and enhancement, even if it's outside the city. And so I personally am happy with the recommendation that's come forward, because it's been a long time coming that we could even do it, and our city staff, I think, has done an excellent job in coming up with something that uses the best of everybody's ideas. And the main thing for me is you're actually getting good enhancement. And it's also, the other things are kind of secondarily good things too, like it costs less and you can administrate it easier. But for future generations, it's all about what we're doing for the environment. So thank you. Great job, you guys.
So committee, just to confirm, we're good with the recommendation moving forward? Okay, you have what you need from us? Okay, thank you. End of committee.
Thank you, Dan. We're going to take a quick technical break and return with Committee of the Whole.